Sarah started this series pointing out that the manipulative and cruel King Xerxes, he groomed young maidens for his own pleasure. And he lost his temper when his queen refused to parade herself in front of his drunk nobles. And this was at the end of a 180-day feast. Sarah challenged us to look carefully at our attitudes to other people, and in particular, whether we are in danger of objectifying women. One of our mission partners is Amber. They work with women selling sex on our Southampton streets. What is our attitude to these women? The man who heads up this work told me just 12 days ago, when I asked him, how do you view these women? And he said, I see Jesus in these women. And when he told me, he had tears in his eyes. I wonder how we view them. Then Steve Braithwaite talked about the importance of fasting, which enabled Esther to approach the king without risking her life. He was a dangerous man, King Xerxes. He challenged us to explore the possibility of fasting, which would enable us to lay down our own agendas and pick up on God's agendas in our lives, to lay down our own agendas and to pick up God's agendas in our lives. And then last week, Keith challenged us to see God in the ordinary and emphasize that God has a plan for each one of us. He mentioned that God was not mentioned in the Bible, but his fingerprints are everywhere. So this week, we concentrate on the fact that time was short, as Alan's just read for us. So time was short before the genocide of all the Jews throughout this huge empire. The empire stretched from Asia and India in the east, right through to Egypt and the Mediterranean in the west. There were 127 provinces, covering 2 million square miles and holding 44% of the population at the time. The genocide was planned for the 7th of March, 473 BC, just 9 months away. So how was this edict to get out to protect the Jews in just 9 months? Just imagine living with the knowledge that you were going to be exterminated in 9 months' time on the 7th of March. No plane, there was no internet, no planes, no other fast ways of getting this new law into every province and every language. And in verse 8, we read the document written in the king's name, sealed with his ring, cannot be revoked. So the king couldn't revoke the edict to kill the Jews, but he could write another law, and this one gave the Jews the rights to assemble, the rights to protect themselves, and the rights to destroy or kill anyone who attacked them. So although the original was still in place, they could now protect themselves. This morning, I'd like to highlight 3 things, if I may. One is Esther's courage, integrity, and humility. The second, the outcome of her courage. And the third one, the sovereignty of God, or God's saving plan. So courage, integrity, and humility. In verse 3, we read, Esther pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan. Remember that it was a dangerous thing to go before the king unless he wanted you to be there. In verse 5, she comes humbly and asks, if it pleases the king, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written, overruling the dispatches that Haman had devised. So why do I emphasize Esther's integrity and particularly her humility? Because in verses 1 and 2 we read that she had been given Haman's estate and that Mordecai had been given the king's signet ring, which gave him huge authority. Between them, they had lots of riches and lots of status. In some ways, they got everything they needed personally, but they couldn't ignore their fellow Jews and the possibility of them being exterminated. And it made me ask the question whether those of us who live in England with security, well, largely, food, freedom to read the Bible, and freedom to worship God, whether we can be satisfied with what we have when there are countless people in our country and around the world who don't know about Jesus, and they cannot easily learn about the God that we want to serve. Esther didn't allow her comfortable situation to blind her to the needs of others, and especially her fellow Jews. And again, I found this very challenging. Esther needed courage to go back to the king to try and reverse the situation. And once again, I'd say, please don't forget that the king could be very nice, but his mood could change very quickly, and he had a temper, and he could be vicious. But she was still humble in her approach to the king. And if we're wanting to share our faith about Jesus with other people, I think we also need to be courageous, because it isn't always easy, is it? But we also need to be humble and gracious, and we need to be people of integrity. Sometimes I wonder whether our evangelism, our outreach to other people is rather insensitive. When Mariel, my wife, and I were helping with a young people's camp some 2 or 3 years ago, the leader, Anthony, always asked us to be very careful with the questions that we asked the young people. And he said, please, whenever you ask a question, give them a way out. What do I mean? Well, let me give you some examples. Do you read the Bible, or is it not something you do? Do you go to church, or do you find that too hard? Are you a person of faith, or are you exploring? Esther's courage, integrity, and humility led to the salvation of her fellow Jews. And what was the outcome of her courage? Well, the outcome was the salvation and deliverance of the Jewish people in verse 16. The day that Haman had chosen to kill the Jews, he chose by lots. And that's why the Jews to this day celebrate the Feast of Purim. Purim means lots. It's celebrated with great joy, feasting, dressing up. And by the way, the next one for the Jews is on the 7th of March, 2026. So if you have Jewish friends, don't forget to celebrate Purim with them. We have a wonderful story of salvation to share with those with whom we live, those with whom we work, and those within our families. And we long that they would accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. But I know this is very hard for many of us, because we ache for some loved ones and close friends to know the salvation of Jesus. May God give us the wisdom, courage, and integrity to live our lives in such a way that we commend Jesus to others. And the outcome was salvation and hope. And we sang about hope in our opening hymn. Jesus said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God? Believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you." Why do I mention that? Because I've been to 2 funerals recently, which were transformed by the fact that the people who had died were followers of Jesus, and therefore they had the hope of heaven. And that comes in contrast to the hopelessness of those who die without a knowledge of where they're going. Thirdly, the sovereignty of God, or God's saving plan. 2 weeks ago, Steve reminded us that God is not mentioned in this book of Esther at all, but he is clearly visible in the story, but behind the scenes. I've often struggled, I don't know about you, but I've often struggled with this idea of the sovereignty of God. Why? Because I hear of so many problems on the news, terrible tragedies, like the stabbings on the train in Huntingdon last night. Violence and brutality throughout the world. And I wonder, why doesn't God stop it? I was amazed to find that there are 59 active state-based conflicts in our world today. 59. That's from the Global Peace Index. When I started preparing this sermon, I sent an email to Mike, our vicar, to ask him how he would explain sovereignty. And he reminded me of a tapestry. So I've borrowed Heather's tapestry. I think this illustrates sovereignty rather well. Because if you look at a tapestry from this side, and apologies to Heather, it looks a shambles. All right? But that's because we don't see the picture that she is sewing. It's sometimes very difficult. By the way, I'll give a free coffee at Sino to anyone who knows what this tapestry is actually about. But now I'll show you. And the flowers, you get an extra cup of coffee if you know that they're golden lilies. Sorry, I didn't show you the back choir, I beg your pardon. And you can't all see it because there's a pillar in the way. The flower, God knows what the picture is meant to be in our lives. He's looking at us from this side, but we are looking at it from the back, and we can't always see what it is. I wonder if we've got the courage to trust the God who is weaving this tapestry of our lives and those around the world. He can see the big picture, and he knows what he's doing. The story of Esther is 473 years before Jesus was born. We can see that God had a plan to save the Jews and us. And then I asked the question, have we got any examples of God's sovereignty in 2025, or have we got to rely on a book that was written about a story 400 plus years before Jesus? Well, we have. A week ago, David and Rachel Butler were acting out as street pastors, another of our mission partners. And they always pray with those praying back at the base, on whom they rely hugely and ring in very frequently to ask for special prayer. They were praying that God would guide them to the right people at the right time. And this is what they sent me. As we walked up a side road near Above Bar, a young man was standing on the pavement watching us. And as we got close to him, he said, "You come from churches, don't you? How do I go to church? Can I just walk in? And what do I do when I'm in there? And what are the rules? And would I be allowed to wear a hat?" He said he didn't know any Christians. He knew nothing about the Bible or Christianity. But in a recent breakup with his partner, he had felt desperate and found, to his surprise, that Jesus had really helped him. He had also had a special tattoo done to celebrate the fact that Jesus had been helping him. I'd love to know. And then he worried about whether God was happy with tattoos. I'd love to walk around the church and ask you how many of you got a tattoo to celebrate an occasion where God had been very special to you. They prayed with him, they talked with him, they prayed with him, they gave him a Bible. Is this not an example of God guiding them to the right person, in the right place, at the right time? God's sovereignty and guidance? You decide. Finally, cast your minds back to earlier in this story. Mordecai challenged his cousin Esther to risk her life by going to the king with these words, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? And who knows but that you and I have come to where we are, with the friends we have, with the family we have, for such a time as this." Esther's courage, integrity, and humility, the outcome of her courage, and the sovereignty of God, or the plan of salvation. Esther showed huge courage, integrity, and humility to risk her life in order to save her fellow Jews. Might we show the similar courage, integrity, and humility in order to tell our friends and families about Jesus? Let's pray that the way we live, the way we speak, and the way we behave will commend Jesus to those we love, to those we live with, and to those we come in contact with. Finally, can I trust God with the things that I don't understand? Can I trust God with the things that I don't understand? A brief